On the morning of 12th May 1968, deep in the red earth highlands west of Kon Tum, the jungle looked almost motionless under a blanket of mist that clung to every leaf and vine like damp cloth. The rising sun was only a pale smear behind the trees when the man who would define the next 6 hours stepped forward, barefoot, silent, carrying nothing but the scars of a lifetime lived under the canopy. His name was Ni, a Montagnard scout whose presence seemed to disappear into the terrain the way wind disappears into still water. For the small CIDG patrol waiting behind him, he was not merely their point man. He was their lifeline. In those days, the Central Highlands had become a silent battleground of infiltration corridors, shadowed trails, and hidden assembly areas the NVA used to push men and weapons south toward Kon Tum, Pleiku, and the Cambodian border routes. McVisog teams tried to disrupt these arteries, but it was often the Montagnards, the indigenous tribes whose understanding of the jungle preceded any map, who made survival possible for American-led patrols. Their senses worked differently in this environment. They could read a single broken blade of grass the way others read printed text, and Yiban was considered one of the best. The patrol he led that morning had a simple assignment: confirm reports of a newly opened NVA feeder route cutting across the Dak Klong tributary. Intelligence analysts believed it was being used nightly to move sappers and ammunition toward pressure points along Highway 14. If true, the area would soon be flooded with enemy forces. If false, the Americans would need to redirect reconnaissance to other sectors before monsoon rains made the trails unusable. Either way, the mission was supposed to be quick, quiet, and uneventful. But in the spring of 1968, nothing in these mountains stayed uneventful for long. As the patrol moved single file, humidity thickened the air until each breath felt heavy. The sky darkened with the early warning of approaching rain, and cicadas droned in long metallic pulses that masked distant movement. The Montagnard fighters behind Yiban carried M1 carbines and chopped down M16s. The American advisor, Staff Sergeant Don Harrigan, carried a PRC-25 radio that hissed softly even when quiet. They were used to tension, but that morning something felt different, something they sensed but couldn't name. Yiban felt it first. He paused at a narrow bend in the trail where the jungle narrowed into a shallow choke point. Ahead, a patch of leaves lay unnaturally still, not undisturbed, just still, as though something beneath them was holding its breath. He crouched, touched the soil, and inhaled sharply. There was wood smoke in the wind, faint but unmistakable, the type that comes from rice husks burned low and cold to avoid detection. It meant someone nearby was cooking, quietly, intentionally. He raised a closed fist, the universal signal to halt the patrol. They froze. Harrigan moved up behind him, whispering, "What is it?" "Tripwire." Yiban didn't answer. Instead, he studied the tree line with the stillness of a predator. To an untrained American eye, the forest ahead looked untouched, a natural corridor of moss, bark, and ferns. But something about the silence wasn't silence at all. It was curated, engineered, too complete, too controlled, as if the jungle had been arranged deliberately to frame the empty trail like bait. Only an experienced tracker could detect the unnatural symmetry. And even among Montagnards, few could read it the way Yiban did. He pointed to the ground. Not far ahead, nearly invisible, were two faint depressions where boots had once stood. They were angled out, not forward, the stance of someone waiting, not passing. The impression was several hours old, softened by night moisture, but still clear enough for someone like Yiban to interpret its meaning. He whispered in Raid, "Ko Cho." Harrigan didn't understand Raid, but he recognized the tone. Ambush. Slowly, carefully, the patrol backed up 10 meters and knelt in the undergrowth. Harrigan tried to raise their forward relay team on the radio, but static chewed the signal into useless fragments. Somewhere above the canopy, thick cloud buildup interfered with transmission. They were effectively alone. Then Yiban did something that left the team uneasy. He removed his knife and handed it to Harrigan. He was going forward unarmed. "Yiban, you can't," Harrigan hissed, but the scout had already melted back into the foliage, barefoot steps making no sound on the slick earth. The patrol watched helplessly as he vanished entirely, leaving only the faint shift of leaves to prove he'd ever been there at all. To anyone unfamiliar with Montagnard warriors, moving unarmed into an ambush sounded suicidal. But to Yiban, the absence of a weapon was an advantage. Steel reflected light. Metal clicked, scraped, snagged. Even the weight changed posture and gait. Unarmed, he was nothing but another shape in the forest, a shadow moving inside a shadow. The terrain ahead formed a natural kill zone, a 20-meter stretch of narrow trail flanked by dense bamboo on one side and a low rise on the other, perfect for enfilade fire, perfect for detonating claymores wired to command triggers hidden in the brush, and perfect for a hunter who understood how to walk through a place like this without disturbing anything a human eye could track. What Yiban sensed, others might have missed. The NVA soldiers preparing the ambush were not careless. They were disciplined infiltrators, likely from the 66th Regiment, veterans of Play Me and Dak To. Their ambush line, from its positioning, seemed designed to kill a larger element, maybe a platoon. But something was off. If their target had been numerous, they would have left more movement traces, more scent, more displaced insects, more residual footprints. Instead, the signs indicated a smaller group, a hunting party. 20 men, maybe more, split along 2 arcs. The Montagnard scout climbed the low rise with the ease of someone who had learned the terrain before he could speak. He placed each footfall on roots that would not bend, stones that would not shift, moss patches that would not compress. Up close, he began to see them. Faint glints of oiled rifle barrels glimpsed through camouflaged netting, the outline of a man's elbow resting on a branch, a boot toe barely visible beneath a fern. He counted them one by one, 5 along the left arc, 7 along the right. More behind in reserve positions, more than 20, and every one of them believed they were invisible. From his vantage, Yiban could hear their whispers, not words, but breaths shaped differently by tension. He could smell the damp canvas of their packs. He could sense the slight shift of a soldier leaning into a firing stance. They were waiting for the patrol to enter the trap, unaware that they themselves were now exposed to someone who hunted differently than they fought. Thunder rolled in the distance. Rain was coming. Rain could hide movement. Rain could distort sound. Rain could give a single unarmed scout the one environmental advantage he needed to do what no one on the patrol, or among the NVA, could imagine. Because when the first drops fell, and the jungle exhaled in steam, Yiban made his decision. He was not going around the ambush. He was going through it. And by the time the first minute of that choice was over, the NVA ambushers still wouldn't understand what exactly they were fighting. They only knew that something they couldn't see was killing them. The first crack of thunder arrived like a warning shot from the sky, rolling across the highlands with a low, shaking growl. Then came the rain, not gentle, not gradual, but sudden and absolute, dropping through the canopy in thick silver rods that hammered leaves, softened soil, and swallowed sound. In seconds, the trail ahead vanished into a curtain of moving water. Visibility shrank, footprints dissolved, scent trails washed clean, and in that chaotic distortion of senses, Yiban became something the NVA had never prepared for. The soldiers along the ambush line instinctively tightened their grips on their rifles. Rain made triggers slippery. It made camouflage netting sag. It rendered tripwire detonators unreliable. A few men shifted to adjust their positions. Others blinked hard to keep water out of their eyes. One squad leader signaled silently for his men to remain still. He believed the storm was a complication, nothing more. He had no idea that the storm had just shifted the balance of power away from modern weaponry and back towards something older, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. Yiban crawled first, his body pressed flat to the softened earth as rainwater streamed over him like camouflage come alive. On the low rise, bamboo culms rattled softly in the wind, masking his movement. The Montagnard scout used the storm the way a painter uses negative space, not as an obstacle, but as a tool. Every gust of wind became a distraction. Every booming thunderclap became a sonic screen. Every twitch of a leaf became a diversion waiting to be amplified. He navigated between the first two NVA riflemen, slipping behind them so silently that the only disturbance came from a leaf shifting under the weight of water. The closest soldier turned his head, sensing something inexplicable, but saw only vegetation bent beneath the rain. When he lifted his foot to adjust his stance, Yiban slid past him and descended the slope toward the right arc of the ambush. There, the enemy had prepared a series of overlapping fire positions, each rifleman confident that the first volley would annihilate anything caught in the kill zone. But ambush doctrine depended on certainty. Certainty of timing, certainty of visibility, certainty of force advantage. The storm destroyed all three at once. Yiban's first strike wasn't with a blade or weapon. It was with the jungle itself. He found a bamboo culm thick enough to hold weight, and with precise timing, he snapped it with his foot. The sharp crack echoed exactly like a rifle bolt being cycled. Soldiers on the left flank reacted instantly, pivoting their attention toward the sound. Meanwhile, on the right flank, one soldier raised his weapon, believing the movement was the signal to tighten the kill zone. Confusion rippled across their line like electricity. In that heartbeat of disorder, Yiban dropped from the slope and landed behind the second arc of ambushers. His landing made no more noise than a fruit falling from a branch. The rain masked everything. Now he was inside their formation. At this range, rifles were slow, bayonets were clumsy. Even a pistol was loud enough to alert the entire platoon. But Yiban needed none of these. Instead, he went still, letting the rain sheet across his face, counting the rhythm of the soldiers' movements. When two men shifted simultaneously to adjust their footing, he surged forward. His hand clamped over the first soldier's mouth from behind, pulling him into the brush with a single fluid motion. The man thrashed, but Yiban found the pressure point below the clavicle and pressed sharply. The soldier collapsed, unconscious before he could scream. His rifle fell into the mud, muffled by the rain. The second soldier turned just in time to see the first vanish. His eyes widened. He stepped forward, bringing his muzzle up, but his boot slipped on wet clay. That hesitation, a single half-second, was all Yiban needed. He swept low, hooked the man's ankle with his heel, and drove him onto his back. The breath blasted from the soldier's lungs. Before he could recover, Yiban pressed his forearm across the man's throat and held until his struggles slowed, then ceased entirely. No gunfire, no cry, no alarm. Two down. Farther ahead, a squad leader sensed something wrong. He whispered to his radio man, trying to contact their company commander, but static drowned the signal. Rain distorted the frequency. The squad leader scanned the terrain, seeing only the shifting grey of rainfall and the jungle's muted sway. It was then that Yiban used one of the oldest Montagnard hunting techniques, the mimicry of distress. He found the unconscious soldier's pack, took the metal clasp and tapped it rhythmically against a rock. The sound imitated a wounded bird's chirp, sharp and panicked, to the untrained meaningless, but to jungle predators and to experienced fighters, it meant vulnerability. 3 NVA soldiers responded immediately, moving toward the noise in a loose wedge. They advanced cautiously, muzzles raised, trying to pierce the moving curtain of rain. When they reached the rock, they split left and right. No enemy, no wounded bird, only the stone and water. The third soldier, lagging behind them, never saw Yiban rise from the foliage behind him. A single precise strike to the temple dropped him instantly. The two soldiers ahead heard the collapse, but mistook it for thunder. One stepped back, confused, and in turning, exposed his flank. Yiban struck fast, sweeping his arm upward against the man's elbow, disarming him before he could fire. He seized the soldier's rifle, flipped it, and drove the buttstock into the man's ribs. A muffled grunt. Collapse. The last soldier tried to run. That made him the easiest of the three. Yiban caught him by the collar, sweeping his legs and pinning him face down in the mud. The rain drowned the man's desperate attempts to shout. Yiban held until the man fell limp. 5 down. Still no gunfire. Still no alarm. The NVA ambush line began to feel it. Not consciously, not yet, but with that primitive sense that something unseen was circling them. A squad leader signaled urgently for his flank to hold position, but the flank did not respond. He signaled again. Nothing. Harrigan and the Montagnard patrol, still hidden far behind, heard only distant, faint rustling drowned by rain. Harrigan checked the time. Yiban had been gone too long. The American's instinct told him to move forward, but he restrained himself. A man like Yiban operated on instinct older than radio signals. To interrupt him would be to put them all in danger. Up ahead, the NVA platoon leader adjusted his cap and scanned the trail below. The kill zone remained empty. No sign of the patrol they expected. Instead, he noticed something far stranger, a slight break in discipline. One of his soldiers no longer held the proper firing stance. Another was not responding to hand signals. The distant left flank looked shifted, as though something had disturbed its anchoring position. His jaw tightened. He signaled for a silent check-in. Only half the line responded. The platoon leader's heartbeat began to rise. Something was inside his formation, something he could not see. The rain intensified, and Yiban moved deeper. By the time the platoon leader realized his formation was unraveling, the jungle had already turned against him. Rain pooled into shallow depressions that softened the earth beneath prone riflemen. Moss grew slick under their elbows. Vegetation that once concealed them now bowed under the weight of water, revealing angles and silhouettes that should have remained hidden. Yet the greatest danger was not the environment. It was the invisible presence moving through it with predatory patience. Yiban Ni watched the enemy with the cold, focused intensity of a hunter who knew that violence was not a fury, but a sequence. Patterns, timing, pressure points, weaknesses, everything he saw in the NVA formation resembled a net pulled too tight. Remove a few knots, and the entire weave would collapse. He understood how to collapse it. He approached the right flank, where 4 riflemen formed an outer arc meant to anchor the ambush. Their positions were strong, overlapping, designed to block escape routes. But the men were wet, uncomfortable, and anxious about the silence from their center line. Yiban could sense their unease. One soldier shifted restlessly, another wiped rain from his eyes, and a third lowered his muzzle just slightly. Small gestures, but to Yiban, each was a wound in their readiness. He climbed the trunk of a leaning tree without a sound, using its wet bark like a ladder. Once perched above the flank, he looked down on the enemy from an angle they had not considered. Rain washed over him, rendering his skin, hair, and clothing indistinguishable from the trunk. He waited for a lightning flash, a brief burst of white that would camouflage his movement inside its afterimage. The sky obliged. Thunder cracked, lightning illuminated the canopy, and in the fraction of a second between brightness and darkness, Yiban dropped. He hit the ground between the first 2 riflemen. By the time they registered movement, he had already swept his leg into the hollow behind the nearest man's knee, collapsing him. As the soldier fell, Yiban struck the second man with a palm-driven blow to the jaw, snapping his head sideways and sending him unconscious into the mud. The third rifleman scrambled to raise his weapon, but the wet sling tangled around his wrist. Yiban pivoted, grabbed the muzzle, and shoved it back into the soldier's chest, knocking him flat. A precise chokehold silenced him before he could call for help. The fourth man attempted to flee, crashing through bamboo in panic. Yiban pursued, his footsteps masked by the roar of the storm. The soldier broke into a clearing and turned to fire. But in his haste, he slipped on a moss-covered root. The rifle discharged into the canopy, and the recoil sent him sprawling. Before he could recover, Yiban was on him, driving a controlled strike into the base of his skull. 4 more down. The platoon leader heard the accidental gunshot. His heartbeat surged. He signaled for all units to prepare to fire, but half the line was still unresponsive. He sent a runner, a young soldier named Truong, to the right flank. Truong stepped into the bamboo corridor, calling softly for his comrades. Only the rain answered. He took another step, then another. He didn't notice the absence of tracks on the ground. The rain had erased them. He didn't notice the way the bamboo leaned slightly inward, bent by the impact of collapsing bodies. He didn't notice the way silence expanded around him until it felt like a physical weight. But what he did notice was the shape lying ahead. A dead NVA rifleman. Truong's breath hitched, too loud. He reached down, turned the body, and saw the man's eyes open, fixed in shock but lifeless. Panic surged through him. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but a hand covered his mouth from behind. Yiban eased him silently into the brush. By now, the patrol behind the Montagnard scout was growing restless. Harrigan checked his watch for the 10th time. The storm made communication impossible. He needed to make a choice: withdraw or advance. A withdrawal risked walking straight into the ambush. Advancing blind into a kill zone was suicide, but staying put seemed equally dangerous. He looked at Yiban's knife in his hand, feeling its weight. He whispered to his interpreter, "Tell the men, if we haven't heard from Yiban in 5 minutes, we move forward slow. No noise, no rifles off safe unless we see something." The interpreter relayed the message in Ride. The Montagnard fighters nodded without fear. They trusted Yiban. They trusted his decisions, but they also understood the jungle well enough to know that even the strongest hunter could fall prey to the unforeseen. Meanwhile, the NVA platoon leader was unraveling. He ordered the left flank to reposition. No response. He signaled the center to tighten the kill zone. Several men obeyed, but their formation was sloppy, hesitant. The enemy they expected still hadn't appeared. Yet their ambush was collapsing from within, as if hollowed out by termites. Fear whispered through the ranks. Yiban sensed it. He moved toward the center line now, the core of the ambush, the backbone of their firepower. 7 soldiers crouched behind a fallen log reinforced with earth, their rifles aimed at the empty trail. They were disciplined, steady, and led by a hardened sergeant whose experience showed in the arrangement of his men. This would not be easy. Yiban took a breath, letting the air fill his lungs, letting the storm mask the sound. He crept closer until he could hear their breaths between thunder rumbles. He didn't need to defeat them with force. He needed to break their cohesion. He found a stone the size of a fist and threw it deep into the brush behind them. It struck with a heavy thud. The sergeant snapped his head toward the sound. 2 soldiers swung their rifles around. Another whispered a warning. The unity of their firing line fractured as each man reacted slightly differently. That was the opening. Yiban surged forward, grabbed the sergeant's collar, and pulled him backward off the log. The sergeant hit the ground hard, knocking the wind from his lungs. His men reacted automatically, pivoting to protect him. That pivot exposed their backs to the jungle. Yiban didn't attack all of them. He targeted only the next most experienced, the second in command. A blow to the throat disabled him instantly. The next soldier tried to scream, but slipped in the mud. Another fired blindly into the trees, the muzzle flash swallowed by rain. Chaos erupted, their formation shattered. Men scrambled backward, some tripping over the fallen log. The storm amplified their panic, turning every shadow into a threat, every gust into movement. Within 60 seconds, the backbone of the ambush had collapsed. The platoon leader watched in horror as his center line dissolved into disorder. He raised his whistle to signal retreat, but before he could blow it, a figure rose from the foliage only 5 meters behind him. He froze. Yiban stood in the rain, hair plastered to his face, chest rising steadily, unarmed yet unshaken. The platoon leader stared at him, unable to comprehend how a single man had penetrated every layer of his defenses. He reached slowly for his pistol. Yiban tilted his head, a gesture not of threat, but of warning. Lightning flashed. The pistol never cleared the holster. With a single step forward, Yiban closed the distance, and the NVA leader finally understood. There was no ambush anymore. There was only the hunter. The platoon leader's hand trembled over the pistol grip, rainwater running down his wrist like streaks of cold mercury. He had led ambushes before, against ARVN units, against American patrols, against Special Forces recon teams. And he had always believed in control, in preparation, in the mathematics of advantage. But now he faced something that defied all logic. A single, unarmed man stood before him, calm amid the storm, breathing with the steady rhythm of someone who lived inside the jungle rather than moved through it. For a fraction of a second, the two men locked eyes. The platoon leader saw no hatred in Yiban's gaze, no rage, not even triumph, only certainty, the terrifying certainty of someone who knew the terrain, the enemy, and the moment far more intimately than any doctrine taught in an officer's school. He drew the pistol. He never had the chance to fire it. Yiban struck with the precision of a seasoned hunter. His hand clamped the leader's wrist, redirecting the weapon downward, while his opposite palm snapped upward into the man's jaw. The leader reeled backward, stunned. Yiban stepped forward, hooked one leg behind the officer's knee, and lowered him silently into the mud. The pistol slipped from the officer's hand, swallowed by runoff water. The leader collapsed, unconscious but alive. Yiban didn't kill unless absolutely necessary. Montagnard warriors were fighters, but they were also pragmatic. A dead man made noise. A living man could be quieted. The platoon leader's collapse sent ripples of panic outward through the remaining ambushes. A handful of NVA soldiers remained unengaged, men stationed deeper in the formation, unsure of what had happened, unsure of what they were facing. They whispered to one another, their discipline evaporating. One suggested retreating toward the river. Another wanted to pull back to higher ground. A third insisted they regroup and launch a blind volley toward the trail. None of them realized that the threat wasn't in front of them. It was already inside their ranks. Yiban anticipated their confusion. He moved quickly, circling behind the last functioning fire team. 3 soldiers huddled together beneath a cluster of dripping vines, unaware that the jungle behind them had rearranged itself into a silent predator. He stepped forward, grabbed the rear soldier by the collar, and pulled him backward into the brush. Before the other 2 could react, Yiban lunged toward the next man, striking his diaphragm with a forceful, targeted blow. The soldier folded over, gasping soundlessly. The third soldier attempted to flee, scrambling to raise his rifle, but his footing slipped in the mud. Yiban caught him, wrestled the weapon away, and silenced him with a precise hold until the man's struggles faded. 3 more down. The storm continued to bury all evidence of violence. Rain hammered every leaf, drowning sound and washing the forest floor into moving streams of ochre mud. To any outsider, the entire highland hillside would have appeared untouched, peaceful even. Only a closer look would reveal the truth. 20 trained ambushers had disappeared into silence, all but one. A lone NVA radioman named Din crouched beneath a fallen tree trunk, clutching his handset. His hands shook so violently that the radio nearly slipped from his grasp. He whispered into the microphone, begging for anyone on the battalion net to answer him. Only static hissed back. He adjusted the frequency. Nothing. Switched channels. Nothing but the distant rumble of thunder bleeding through the static. He stared at the forest around him, breathing shallowly. He saw no muzzle flashes, no silhouettes, no movement except rain and wind. The jungle looked alive, too alive, as if it were breathing in unison with the storm. Dinner felt a pressure in his chest, something primal and ancient, telling him to stay still, to lower his voice, to avoid attracting attention. Then he heard footsteps behind him, soft, barefoot, intentional. He froze. His instinct screamed at him not to turn around. The footsteps stopped just behind him. Slowly, reluctantly, he looked over his shoulder. Yiban stood there. Din's lips trembled. He dropped the radio. The Montagnard scout stepped forward, placed a hand on the man's rifle, and gently pushed it down. Then, with a quiet firmness, he gestured toward the opposite direction of the patrol. A clear command. Leave. Go home. Live. Din blinked rainwater out of his eyes, staring at the unarmed man who had dismantled an entire ambush without firing a shot. He realized then that the jungle did not belong to uniformed armies, did not obey ideological lines, did not favor one side over another. It favored those who understood it, those who respected it, those who lived with it rather than against it. Yiban stepped back, disappearing into the foliage with a movement so fluid it seemed supernatural. Din stumbled to his feet and sprinted through the forest until his legs failed him. By the time he regained his strength, he was kilometers away. Back near the trail, the storm began to break. Rain softened into a drizzle. The oppressive clouds thinned until slivers of pale sunlight pierced through. A hush fell over the highlands, a heavy silence that felt almost reverent. Harrigan signaled the patrol forward. The Montagnard fighters moved cautiously, rifles low but ready, advancing along the edge of the kill zone. They stepped around bamboo, ducked beneath vines, traced the perimeter of what should have been a deadly ambush site. Harrigan scanned the area for signs of explosives, tripwires, or bodies. He found none. What he found instead were impressions in the mud, dozens of them, showing where NVA soldiers had lain in wait. But many of the impressions trailed off erratically, suggesting sudden movement, collapse, or flight. Harrigan's pulse quickened. Then he saw Yiban standing on the rise above the trail, rain dripping from his hair and shoulders, chest rising slowly. He lifted one hand in a signal, all clear. Harrigan approached him. "Yiban, what happened out here?" The Montagnard scout knelt, brushing his fingers across the softened earth. He said something in raid. The interpreter translated quietly, "He says the ambush is gone." Harrigan looked around at the empty jungle. "Gone? Where? How many were there?" Yiban raised his fingers. 1, 2, 3, until he reached 20. Harrigan stared at him. "And you took care of them?" Yiban didn't answer. He didn't need to. Harrigan looked again at the jungle, the silent dripping trees, the disturbed mud, the faint drag marks that vanished into the brush, the empty firing positions. It made no sense. 20 trained ambushers, armed and ready, outmaneuvered by a single unarmed scout. It shouldn't have been possible, but it had happened. The storm had passed. Steam curled up from the ground. The trail behind them remained quiet. The mission could continue. But Harrigan knew they'd witnessed something few would ever understand. The patrol advanced slowly through the aftermath, stepping over slick roots and mud softened to the consistency of wet clay. The air felt heavy with a strange stillness, a quiet so dense it bordered on sacred. Birds had not yet returned after the storm, and the only sounds were dripping branches and the faint whisper of wind climbing the ridge. Harrigan kept scanning the tree line, half expecting a counterattack, half expecting to find bodies. But the jungle concealed everything Yiban had done. It swallowed the violence and the fear and the chaos as though the events of the last hour had never happened. Yiban walked ahead of the patrol, barefoot and silent, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. To him, what had unfolded was not a miracle or an act of supernatural prowess. It was simply a necessary choice made in the only language the jungle respected: precision, patience, and understanding. He did not boast, and he did not explain. He only gestured for the patrol to keep moving. As they descended toward the Dak Klong tributary, Harrigan finally found his voice. "Yaban," he said softly, "you saved all of us." Yaban glanced back at him. His expression remained calm, almost detached, but something in his eyes softened. He spoke briefly. "He says the jungle showed him the path." Harrigan wanted to press him, to understand how one man could dismantle 20 trained soldiers without a weapon, but he sensed that the answer would not come from questioning. The answer was woven into Yaban's upbringing. Born into the forest, raised by hunters who could track footprints on stone, mentored by elders who taught him to read silence as others read books. To demand an explanation would be like asking a river how it flowed, or asking the wind why it moved. Some things were beyond articulation. When they reached the tributary, the storm runoff had swollen the waterway into a shallow torrent. Harrigan tested the depth with his boot, then signaled the team to cross in staggered formation. The forest loomed on the opposite bank, darker and thicker, but the atmosphere felt lighter than before, as if the jungle, having witnessed a contest between predator and prey, now allowed the patrol safe passage. Halfway across, Harrigan turned to Yaban. "You didn't kill all of them, did you?" he asked. Yaban shook his head. "Why spare the radio man?" The Montagnard paused, then spoke a phrase so quiet the rain nearly drowned it out. The interpreter hesitated before translating. "He says one must live to remember." Harrigan exhaled, unsure whether the words carried mercy or warning. Perhaps both. Once across the river, the patrol moved deeper into NVA infiltration territory. They found the new feeder route exactly where intelligence had predicted, a narrow, freshly cut path running parallel to the water, littered with sandal prints and the faint smell of rice and gun oil. Harrigan photographed the prints, marked coordinates on his map, and radioed in a coded update when the clouds thinned enough to allow transmission. A distant voice crackled through the static. "Copy. Relay to prairie fire. Hold for extraction window." Harrigan nodded to himself. They would be heading home soon, but first they needed to reach the extraction point alive. The sun began to break through the canopy, turning raindrops into bright beads of light. Steam rose from the ground in thin, ghostly tendrils. The patrol continued cautiously, but their morale had shifted. What had begun as a mission that could easily have ended in disaster now felt strangely fortified, as though the jungle had chosen to lend them its strength. Yaban guided them with effortless certainty. He avoided animal trails that might intersect with human movement, skirted around depressions where water pooled too deeply, and led the patrol across ridgelines that offered concealment from possible enemy lookouts. Every decision he made carried the weight of ancestral intuition that had kept Montagnard tribes alive for centuries. By the time they reached the extraction clearing, the afternoon light had dipped toward gold. A UH-1 Huey roared in from the southwest, its rotor wash whipping the grass flat. The crew chief leaned out, signaling them to board quickly. Harrigan ushered his men inside, but Yaban hesitated at the tree line, staring back into the jungle as though listening to something only he could hear. Harrigan approached him. "You coming, partner?" Yaban nodded slowly. As they lifted off, the rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust and steam. From above, the jungle looked unified again, its canopy restored, its secrets hidden. There was no sign of the ambush, no sign of the violence that had unfolded beneath the leaves. Only the endless green of the highlands, rolling like an ocean frozen in place. Harrigan sat across from Yaban in the cabin, studying him. "I'm going to write this up," he said. "What you did today. People need to know." Yaban shook his head firmly. "He says no," the interpreter added. "He says this was not a story for soldiers. It was a story for the jungle." Harrigan frowned. "Then why help us? Why fight at all?" Yaban looked out the open door of the Huey, watching the canopy slip beneath them. When he finally spoke, his voice nearly vanished beneath the thrum of the engine. "He says the war is loud. Too loud. Someone must speak for the quiet places." Harrigan didn't fully understand. Not then, not even years later. But he respected the sentiment. The Montagnards walked between worlds, the brutal world of modern war and the ancient world of the forest. And some men, like Yiban, were built to keep balance between them. In the years that followed, rumors circulated among NVA survivors about what had happened that day. Some claimed the jungle spirit had attacked them. Others whispered about a ghost warrior who moved with thunder. The lone radio man, Din, insisted he'd seen a man, not a ghost, but that he'd moved like one. His testimony, passed through fragmented accounts and political suppression, became a quiet legend among soldiers operating near Kon Tum. As for Yiban Ni, he survived the war, though survival brought its own burden. His people suffered displacement, loss of land, and the harsh aftermath that followed the withdrawal of American forces. Yiban continued guiding, hunting, teaching younger tribesmen what he knew of the forest, though he grew increasingly silent about the war. Harrigan tried to find him years later, but never succeeded. Some said Yiban retreated into the deep highlands. Others said he crossed into Cambodia. A few believed he became a spiritual protector of the land he fought for. What he left behind was not a report, not a medal, not a headline, but a story carried quietly among those who understood what the jungle demanded of its children. Stories like his reveal a truth often buried beneath the machinery of war, that technology, firepower, and doctrine matter, but not more than the human being who interprets the world around him. And in Vietnam, a war of shadows, rain, and hidden paths, the ones who survived longest were those who listened, who adapted, who let the land teach them how to move. Yiban showed that a single man, unarmed yet deeply attuned to the environment, could undo an entire ambush, not through brute strength, but through understanding. He proved that knowledge can be a weapon sharper than steel, and silence can be a force more devastating than gunfire. His story endures because it forces us to rethink what power means and who truly holds it. If you want more stories like this, or if you want to explore the unseen corners of Vietnam's war-torn jungles, stay with us.